Dracula, the Resurrection for PC. Also available for PSX, but we're not looking at that version. The first in the series of graphic adventures based on Bram Stoker's famous vampire tome, released in 1999 by former French studio Index Plus, and now available on GOG.com courtesy of Microids, which is another French outfit apparently. Dracula the Resurrection is a sequel of sorts to the Dracula novel that most everyone is familiar with, from the days when vampires were feared creatures of the night, and not sparkly models or whatever the cool or uncool thing kids do with vampires these days. Anyways, Dracula the Resurrection is the first game in a series of Dracula games that the company would release, followed by 4 more games. GOG.com actually sells the first 3 games as a package deal called the Dracula Trilogy, and you figure, sweet, 3 games for a relatively cheap price. Yeah, well, there's a reason for that, but we'll get to that later down the road, I suppose. Taking place some 7 years after the conclusion of the final battle in the novel, you assume the role of Jonathan Harker, now happily married and settled in London until a letter from your missing wife Mina comes along and begins the chain of events that sets up tonight's adventure that takes middle-aged Harker back to the haunted grounds of Transylvania, where the old vampire count may have been resurrected, presumably either through black magic or because somebody gathered up all the body parts across the land, burned them in a pot, and then out came Dracula. Hey, if this shit's good enough for Konami, it's probably good enough for the French. Probably wouldn't fly with the Quebecois, but that's another story entirely. Dracula the Resurrection is a point-and-click adventure game. You move a cursor around a static environment, admire the 360-degree panoramic segments as you move said cursor around because that's the only motion you're getting in this game unless you're climbing steps or trigger a video sequence. And once you come across a thing that changes the cursor into something indicating some form of interaction, you can click on that thing and something will happen. Your actions include clicking on people and talking to them about various subjects, clicking on things to examine them, collect them, use them, or generally click on things that will lead you to other things, requiring even more things you've stored in your inventory to advance you further into the game. I'm not getting too technical here, am I? Didn't think so. Point-and-click adventure games usually place more emphasis on puzzle solving and exposition than any semblance of action. So if you're looking for some vampire-killing action, Dracula the Resurrection is not going to be providing you with that. Actually, Resurrection doesn't provide you with much in the way of interaction either. You're basically going from one place to another, finding a key item to use to go to another place that will lead you to another place, and during which times you'll have brief full-motion video sequences play out to push the somewhat paper-thin story forward. And that's probably the biggest weakness with Resurrection. There's not much to it. First half of the game has you finding a way to reach the castle, and the second half takes place at the castle itself. A lot of the puzzles are fairly repetitive in nature. The number of times you'll be using this dragon ring gimmick to open doors and such is quite high, though once you get to the castle they do get a bit more challenging to figure out. Adventure games of this ilk thrive on their narratives, and while Dracula the Resurrection positions itself as a follow-up to the original Dracula novel, there is very little substance in its storytelling. Like I said, you're mostly roaming around rooms in the outdoors, trying to find things to access other things and such, and the same thing applies once you get to the castle, except indoors and such, and outside of the local inn and some brief bits with the opposition, your interactions with other characters are relatively sparse, particularly as it relates to another major character and head of the house whose name is on the box. He doesn't show up all that often. Oh well. At the very least, this isn't a particularly long game. It'll probably take you a couple hours tops to actually beat it, and there's very little to see that deviates from the given path. Despite that, the game does allow you to save your progress at any point. Control is done entirely with the mouse and is fairly functional for the most part. Left click to interact with things, right click to bring up your inventory. Fairly straightforward stuff in that regard. I've heard some people mention that finding things to interact with can be a bit of a hassle because the positioning of certain points are almost precise, and oftentimes it can feel like you need to highlight a specific pixel to register anything. The dark visuals probably wouldn't help matters either, though I don't quite mind it overall. A setting like this should be somewhat dark and gloomy. The graphics are interesting to say the least. Should be noted for its day, Dracula the Resurrection was somewhat praised for its visual presentation. These remarkably rendered CG cinematics and panoramic scenery during the interactive bits. Had I played this back in 1999 or even 2000, I probably would have been impressed by the CG bits. In 2022, through more modern eyes, some of the faces on these characters are creepy and cartoonish all at once, and I don't know whether I should congratulate the designers or not in achieving that effect. Now, when it comes to the overall scenery, those hold up fairly well, I think. A lot of CG rendered bits, obviously, and you're mostly observing static scenery, but they convey the kind of dark, dreary atmosphere you'd expect from a game involving the Count, and the panoramic view of these sceneries is quite a feat for its day. And for what it's worth, the video is rather well done. Somewhat grainy by today's standards, but that actually adds to the grim atmosphere that Dracula tries to convey here. The voice acting's another story. It's passable fare for the most part, but the accents throw me off. Jonathan sounds a bit too American, and the others come across as somewhat comedic. On a more positive note, the few bits of music that play is pretty good, somewhat evoking the Coppola Dracula movie soundtrack from the early 90s, but still pretty solid. A pity you don't get to listen to any music during the interactive bits, they only play during the video bits. Which is... Overall, Dracula the Resurrection is a mixed bag. Those wanting something with a little more action in their vampire killing isn't going to find what they're looking for here, and quite frankly, there's already a series of games that fills that niche quite nicely. But even as a point-and-click adventure game, there's very little substance going for it. More than anything, however, the Resurrection feels like a smaller chunk of a much larger game, and I guess that's somewhat the case here, as The Last Sanctuary would come along later, but that's another story. If you want to give this a shot, it's available on GOG.com, sold as part of the Dracula trilogy with 2 other games, and that's probably the best way to go. There's also a PS1 version, but the PC version these days is cheaper. 3 games for less than 10-ish, I suppose. It's probably the best way to go. But there's better adventure games or Dracula games or whatever out there. Your mileage is going to vary on this one.